This time on Introductory Politics, we are moving beyond our first three articles of the U.S. Constitution dealing with Congress, the executive branch, and the federal courts, and move on into the remaining articles of the U.S. Constitution. Article 4 that we have dealt with talks about the full faith and credit clause, which talks about how states have to respect certain acts, records, judicial proceedings of other states. Article 5 contains the amendment process to the U.S. Constitution. And Article 6 ends up discussing various other elements, namely containing the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution says that this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land. This idea of the Supremacy Clause essentially articulates that whenever there is some type of conflict between, say, what the U.S. Constitution may guarantee as a right, state constitutions that may disregard that right are not able to do so because of the Supremacy Clause. Article 6 contains other elements as well, namely issues related to debt, sovereign debt, and state level debt, issues related to whether or not there's going to be some sort of oath that is allowed to be taken, whether or not there's going to be a religious test as a means of qualification, which it's not, and various other small elements like that. Article 7 of the U.S. Constitution is simply a ratification clause. This is the only text of Article 7 that you can see here. It says that the ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states, so ratifying the same. Ultimately, all this means is that in order for this constitutional document to become a valid constitution, it needed to be approved by 9 states. The reason why this needed this particular kind of language is because this is the second constitution we have had in United States history. The first one being the Articles of Confederation. This U.S. Constitution replaces the Articles of Confederation, and so we essentially needed 9 states to approve for that transition to occur. One of the big issues, again, on that transfer from the Articles of Confederation into this U.S. Constitution had to do with the significant differences between those two documents. The original Articles of Confederation created a governmental system that was incredibly weak, a federal governmental system that was incredibly weak, and gave most powers to the states. States were loosely connected to one another under this United States, and the Congress that the Articles of Confederation created was virtually powerless. They had very few powers, say in terms of their number, and also had a very difficult time exercising those powers because they essentially needed every state to agree for the most part. And so when it comes to the when it comes to that Articles of Confederation, it made the process of governance very difficult. And part of that ends up kind of showing itself through various events historically, such as Shays' Rebellion, which is where the state of Massachusetts essentially needed help from the federal government in order to put down a rebellion. And Congress said that they would, but they ended up not being able to send any money because they didn't have the money to send them. They asked for states to send the money to Massachusetts. The state said no, and so it created a very difficult situation for the state of Massachusetts whenever it came to putting down this rebellion. This was essentially one of the final straws that breaks the camel's back, if you will, and it leads to the development of this U.S. Constitution. However, again, in the late 1780s, this is not necessarily easy to switch from one constitution to the next. There was a significant number of people, a large number of states, that even though they recognized that the old Articles of Confederation were not the best way to establish a government, that it was still largely a good idea, but that we needed to make some changes to tweak the Articles of Confederation. Ultimately, in the end, out of a constitutional convention, we end up with this document that we've been looking at in this U.S. Constitution, but it needed to be ratified, as Article 7 said. So when it came to this ratification process was very slow. It was very contentious. And ultimately, we ended up with two large factions, two large groups of people that emerged out of this constitutional convention. We called those the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were the ones who agreed with the new Constitution and thought that it was good to have a centralized government that was much stronger than the one that was created under the Articles of Confederation. But then we have the anti-federalists who thought that this new constitution essentially gave too much power to this national government and thought that that it was essentially going to lead to the federal government becoming too powerful and that a lot of the power really should remain with the states. In the end, we have a series of essays that are written in the newspapers, written and distributed by newspaper to the public in order to essentially make the case for or against this new constitution. And this is where we end up with the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers. When it comes to the Federalist Papers, we'll look at a couple of those, Federalist Paper number 10 and Federalist Paper number 51, because they both in conjunction set out essentially the primary fundamental argument as to why this new constitutional document is necessary. James Madison in Federalist 10 is going to argue that essentially the reason that we need a strong central government is essentially to control people. And we need to control people, Madison is going to argue, because when we have lots of people who ultimately find some sort of common interest, that they will essentially gang up on people who are outside of that common interest. And so one of the things that we can see here with the text on the screen, Madison says that these factions, these groups of people, will become united and actuated by some common impulse of passion, like a common interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. Madison's primary argument is that when we as human beings find other human beings that we kind of agree with, have some sort of common interest with, that we will essentially form a group. And as a group, we will empower that group to then essentially hate on other groups that don't align with that interest. And so Madison says that this is actually kind of core about human beings, that this is not something that is, an accident, essentially, that this is something that is just something that human beings do. Again, there's a lot of text here on the screen. I'll just read through it, but this again is Madison essentially making the claim as to why these factions go bad, why they end up beating up on other people, say ganging up on others, that sort of stuff. Madison's going to say here in Federalist 10 that the latent causes, the underlying causes here, the latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man. Again, Madison's making the claim here that this is not by accident, that this is something that is just intrinsic within us. And we see them everywhere, brought into different degrees of activity according to the different circumstances of civil society. These are a zeal for different opinions concerning religion, that we will have battles essentially between groups based on religious differences, concerning government, political differences, and many other points, as well as speculation as of practice, an attachment to different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power. We will form groups based on kind of who we want to be our leader, or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to the human passions. These have in turn divided mankind into parties. It has inflamed them with mutual animosity and has rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. Madison is not pulling any punches here. He is essentially arguing that we will find reasons as human beings, we will find reasons to gang up on other groups of people. And we will do that essentially with no real reason. He says that when, for example, when it says where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions, the tiniest things, have been sufficient to essentially cause violence. And so Madison's going to say that this is what we need to avoid, that this is something that this is kind of endemic. This is something that is inherent within human beings. And so we need a strong government, a strong national government to stop that from happening. So Madison then essentially goes into to then talk about what the possible ways are to solve this problem. And he essentially argues that there are three different ways. One way to solve the problem is to just take away everyone's liberty, essentially forcefully control the lives of every person as much as possible. Madison is going to say that that is not what we should do, as in this is possible to work, but certainly not what we're trying to do in the United States. We rebelled from tyranny under a king, and so we don't want to go back to a very strong centralized authority that essentially runs our day-to-day lives. And so while like destroying liberty is something that maybe theoretically could work, it's not something that realistically can work in the United States. So he then says that there's another option, and the other option is, well, if basically the difference is, or the issue is, we have one group of people who believe something, and they end up hating on a different group of people who believe something differently, then one way to possibly solve this problem is just get everybody to agree about everything. Again, Madison's going to say here that this is, in theory could work, but certainly is impossible. And so this is not really a plausible option. So he says that there's really only one way forward. And the only way to really solve the problems that factions can create is to just control them as much as possible. So this is where he says he includes this text here in his essay. He says that the majority, having such coexistent passion or interest, must be rendered by their number and local situation unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. We have to stop them. We can't stop groups from forming, so we have to stop them from oppressing other people. And so this last part here, he says, in the extent and proper structure of the union, therefore, we behold a Republican remedy for the diseases most incident to Republican government, essentially further on making the claim that having a stronger government is the only real way to try to solve this problem of oppressive factions. Federalist 51, largely assumed to be Alexander Hamilton writing here in Federalist 51, makes a similar claim, but ends up with a different angle, where Madison is essentially articulating that we need a strong central government, essentially to control people because we are going to devolve into oppression. Hamilton's going to take a bit of a turn and say again fundamentally the same thing, that human beings to some level are all corrupt. That there is something, there's no perfect human being. We are all likely, it is within us to oppress other people, whatever it may be, right? However we would want to phrase it, that we are not perfect. So Hamilton says here, for example, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And so when it comes to this selfishness, rent-seeking behavior, taking advantage of other people type of behavior, whatever it is, again, however we want to frame that, we need a government to control it, right? So it starts off with that basic premise again. But again, here's where we see the turn. Hamilton is going to make the argument that when it comes to corruptible people, right, if no one is perfect and people will at some point make decisions to essentially enrich themselves, to make themselves more powerful, to make themselves more money, make themselves more popular, whatever you might want to think here, that government will be used to do that if people occupy positions in government. Hamilton's basically making the claim here, government in and of itself is not what can can cause corruption, if you will. Government is not corrupt. It's the people who operate within government that corrupt the government. So government becomes a means to an end. And so he says it this way, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, control the people, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. And so, where again he finally lands when it comes to this angle is to say that this is why we need checks and balances, we need separation of powers, etc. So he says it this way, to divide the legislature into different branches, a bicameral legislature, to render them by different modes of election, different principles of action, as little connected with each other as possible. So this is ultimately what Hamilton and Madison are arguing in the Federalist Papers, is that we have people are an issue because no one is perfect. People will do bad things. And so if people occupy the government or if they just stay in society, we need to devise a government that can control the bad effects of both. And that this new US Constitution is the solution to that problem. Ultimately, we do end up obviously getting enough states to ratify this US constitutional document, and we end up with our new US Constitution.